Hello, hello. We are back. One more time. We're talking about the Lucas critique. Remember where we were is we had talked about the Phillips curve and how there was this relationship between inflation and unemployment that was working across time for hundreds of years, extremely stable. And then once we left the gold standard, it disappeared. And we have a story for that. And our story is, again, these short-term contracts. That is, people get into short-term wage contracts, either an official contract or just informally. We're not going to renegotiate wages every week. We're going to do it once a year or whatever, right? And so you're in these short-term contracts, which means that when you make these short-term contracts, you have to make a prediction about inflation. And in the old days, in the gold standard, monetary authorities didn't really have control of the money supply, so all you had to do was try to predict economic conditions. A difficult job. You're going to be wrong a lot of the time, but all you're doing is trying to predict economic conditions. And so any randomness around that is going to be sometimes inflation is higher than you expected, unemployment is lower, sometimes it's less than expected, unemployment is higher, but you're going to have a stable expected unemployment. Because it's just economic conditions. Right? Move around a little bit, but in the general neighborhood. Okay? Then after the gold standard was abandoned, now central banks had the ability to control the money supply, which indirectly, but reasonably directly, leads to controlling inflation. So if they want inflation to go up, they can make it go up. If they want it to go down, they can make it go down. Okay? Whether it's worth it or not is a different thing, but they can do it if they want to. Okay? Which means, and they all knew about the Phillips curve, everyone knew about the Phillips curve, which means that you could start to think about using inflation to change unemployment, because you know that there's this relationship. And so you can think, if I increase inflation, that's bad, but maybe it'll bring down unemployment. So you have this extra incentive to try to, increase inflation in order to reduce unemployment. Okay? And that's all well and good, except that people are going to start taking that into account. When they're forming their new wage expectations, or their inflation expectations to set their wages, they're going to say, well, there's all the reasons to expect inflation that there was before, plus there's this new reason that the central bank might want to increase inflation to reduce unemployment. So you're going to have higher inflation expectations than you otherwise would have because they have this possibility. And because of that, your short-run Phillips curve is going to start shifting. It's going to shift upward, which is our story for why the thing broke down. And that leads us to the Lucas critique. We had our gossip about Mr. Lucas last time, but here we want to talk about what he's talking about. And this is sort of a general statement about using empirical results to make predictions about policy. Okay? It's very often thought of as a macroeconomic thing, that it's a statement about macroeconomics, but in fact it is much, much, much broader than that. It encompasses whenever you're using empirical results that are about things with brains. Okay? So we can think about the same thing like if you're having empirical results for animals or wolves or anything. Anytime you have things with brains that you're studying, the Lucas critique is going to be applicable. It is not applicable in physics or chemistry or anything, because you talk about things that don't have brains. Okay, so what's the idea? So the idea is we're going to be looking at a bunch of data, right? We're going to be looking at all this data, and that data came from a certain environment. People were behaving a certain way, and you analyze this data, and you figure out how they're behaving, right? And that's great. You learn something about what was going on. In our case, we learned a relationship between inflation and unemployment, but we could have learned something about how wolves behave in a certain environment. Anything. We analyze the situation, and we see the data, and maybe we find, if we're lucky and skillful and all is right with the world, we find a relationship between things in the data. Okay? But all of that, by the nature of data, is coming from the past, because how the space-time continuum is organized, we only can look at the past, we're unable to look at the future. It's a major flaw in all of our studies. And so we're looking at the past, and there was a certain environment involved in that past. Okay? And because there was a certain environment in that past, people using their brains, or wolves using their brains, were behaving in accordance with that environment. The environment that they were in particular, in our case, the policy environment that they're in, is going to change how they behave. It's going to change how they form expectations. It's going to change how they behave. And so all of our data is based on their behavior, which is what we're studying, but that's all based on the policy environment that was there when it happened. Right? And so if we change our policy, whatever policy that is, it has the potential to change their behavior because their behavior was based on the policy they were in. If it's a brand new policy, maybe they behave the same way, but maybe they don't. Maybe it's an important policy for them, right? And they change their behavior. Okay? Now, as we do that, this can alter the results of our empirical relationship because we're studying how things were behaving before. We change the policy, they're going to behave differently. And so maybe the things that we learned from all this data are going to be different from what happens when we change the policy. Okay? And in our particular case, it even caused the relationship to disappear altogether, okay, in the Phillips curve case. Okay? So what to do about this? Well, one of the major reasons, not the only reason, but one of the major reasons why we study stuff is to try to make the world a better place. Other people are trying to make the world a worse place, but we are good people. We're trying to make the world a better place. And so we are hoping, well, most of us anyway, but most of us are trying to make the world a better place to the best of our little abilities. And we're thinking about how do we change, in this case, economic policy to try to make the world a better place. So we really do need to study how people are behaving, but we can only do that from the past. And for that, that's only the past policy stuff that was going on, right? But we want to think, okay, that was what was going on. How do we make it better? We are by nature thinking about how do we change the policy. In this case, it was the gold standard policy, but it could be anything. It could be tax policy. It could be, do we, increase child benefit, all kinds of things that we could play around with policy-wise. But if we change any of those things, it's going to change people's behavior, and potentially everything that we learn from the data is going to be worthless or different from what we get. And so we really want to make predictions. If we do this, we're going to get those results. But it's very difficult to do that unless this that we're doing is something just like what happened before. Right? I bring up the wolves because of the whole alpha male thing. Right? Because they studied those wolves and they came up with the alpha male thing. But of course, they studied wolves in captivity, which is a very different policy environment than wolves out in the real world, right? And so when they took that data that they got from the wolves in captivity and they took it to wolves in the wild, it was totally different behaviors because it was a different policy environment. So anything with brains is going to have this problem, right? That they're reacting to the situation that they're in, and therefore if we change the situation, that can change their reactions. Okay. So we're kind of screwed, right? This is saying, you can look at the data all you want, but you're going to learn nothing of value because when we actually try to use it, it may change or disappear. Well, it's not quite that grim. It's kind of that grim, but it's not quite that grim because we have brains as well. Not great ones, but we got them. And what we can do is we can try to understand why people were behaving the way they were. And if we understand why they were behaving the way they were, then we can start to think about, well, how are they going to change their behavior as we change the policy environment? Right? So how are they going to change, in this case, how are they going to change their behavior when we go off the gold standard? Of course, going off the gold standard was so sudden and weird that we didn't really study it too much ahead of time, but potentially we can do that. Right? So we think, And so this is like, the Lucas critique is not saying abandon all empirical work. It is saying, you're not going to be able to really use it. You're not going to be able to be sure that you can use it until you understand why people are behaving the way they were. Right? So you need both an understanding, which is a theory, and the theory is great, but usually in theory there's 4 different effects that all go different directions, and how big they are is important. And so you need the empirical stuff as well. Right? You need them to work hand in hand in order to really make predictions about what's going on. You need to both measure stuff, and you need to understand why it is the way that it is. Okay. This is the Lucas critique. Now this is, again, typically thought of as a macroeconomic thing. But again, it's not. It applies to wolves. It applies to macroeconomics. And very importantly, it applies very, very, very much to business. And the typical story in business is like you're a manager of something and you want to change things to make profit bigger and people have whatever. You're trying to make the business better for whatever your definition of better is. Currently, for the last 60, 70 years, it's been increased shareholder value, but that's something new. Okay, it can change. But you're trying to make the business better, right? More profit, say. More profit. Why not? Have as much profit as you like. Trying to make profits higher, right? And so your typical thing is to say, well, I'm a manager. I can't see what everyone's doing, but I can measure certain things. And so there is a tendency to target those things that you can measure and get things better. The thing is, you are working with people, and most people, not everybody, but most people have brains, and so they are subject to the Lucas critique. That is, when you change how you are rewarding people, or you change how you're measuring success, you are going to change people's behavior in the process. Right? And we see this over and over and over and over again. The big guy who was like, I forget the other guy's name, but one of the guys that sort of started the whole MBA thing was Robert McNamara when he was head of General Motors. And it was the guy that was head of IBM too, whose name I forget. Bunch of pals, they got together, they started the whole thing about MBAs. And their thing was, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And you can measure anything. That was their sort of worldview. And the whole start of MBAs was, let's go out and let's measure the business, what the business is doing, and then once we measure it, we can target things that will make the business better, and therefore make things better. Okay? Oddly enough, it was Vietnam that really put the nail in the coffin of this dumb idea, because Robert McNamara famously was the head Secretary of Defense during Vietnam. Very, very clever boy. And so he was measuring everything because, war is the same. You measure stuff. And so they were counting, how many of the enemy got killed, how many of us got killed. And of course, as you do that, you start rewarding people for, more body bags on the other side. And the easiest way to create bodies on the other side, we'll make it up. Is actually the easiest. You say kill civilians. Yes, you could do that, and people did. But you can also just make it up, right? And so they got all kinds of fake numbers coming up to them because everyone wanted to look good, right? Other famous examples are for programmers, like very, very foolishly, deciding that what they're going to do is they're going to reward programmers based on how many bugs they fix. And so programmers started throwing in all kinds of bugs into their software so that they could fix them really easy. People have brains. If you start targeting any one particular thing, or anything, if you start targeting anything, people will maximize that, right? And so it could be like a perfectly natural, reasonable thing to measure and to think about, but as you start to target it, as you start using it to make your decisions, that's going to change everyone's behavior. And even a perfectly reasonable, sensible thing can have perverse effects as people change their behavior. It is just the Lucas critique. It applies to everything involving people with brains, which is terrible because, we're in a data-driven world now, and it's very tempting just to say, oh, we got the big data and it spit out this answer, so we should therefore do that. But you still need to think, if we're doing that, how is that going to change people's behavior? Okay. That's all. I don't want to bang on about it because it's not particularly hard, but I kind of do because it is particularly important. You have to think about how any policy change you make is going to affect how, in our case, people react to it, or wolves, or whatever brain thing with brains that you've got. Cthulhu. Okay, so that's the Lucas critique. But now, because we are economists, at least in this class we're economists, we want to think we have this story about the Phillips curve. But what does equilibrium look like in this story? We said, okay, things are going to be, the whole system broke down as soon as we drop the gold standard and the Phillips curve starts to shift. But we have a model, which is a story about how the world works. And we want to figure out, how does this imply that the world will actually work now that we have left the gold standard? Okay, we know how it would work in the gold standard. Phillips curve would stay fairly stable and we'd get that stable relationship. But now that we're out of the gold standard, where's it going to settle down to? Okay. All the data points I gave you were sort of in the process of leaving. You could think that that's maybe not long-run equilibrium. But in the long run, what are things going to look like? Okay. So I'm going to put a little bit of story in there, because to make this work, to talk about equilibrium, we have to talk about what the central bank wants, right? Because the central bank is now kind of a player in this game. They're kind of an active participant. They're deciding how much inflation we should have. And so we have to have their motivations in there somewhere. So I'm going to start by supposing some motivations. We are going to assume that they have some ideal level of inflation and some ideal level of unemployment. Okay. Now, you could say, well, they want zero unemployment. That's probably not true, right? We don't want people leaving university to take the first dumb job they find. We want them to look around and take some time and get a good match, right, that uses their skills and makes them happy in life and all of that. So some unemployment is certainly necessary, right, in our real world, right? Ideally, we would be some kind of perfect Vulcan matching thing going on, but that's not the world we live in. In real life, it's going to be a little messy, and so there's going to be some unemployment. So they have a target rate out there, some target rate of unemployment. Likewise, they have target rate of inflation. Normally, we think this is probably in the 2% range. That is, having 0% inflation can be problematic because sometimes prices have to go down, like wages have to go down in a particular industry, and that's hard to do. Whereas if we have 2% inflation, we can just keep people's wages constant, and therefore their real wages going down. Typically, we think 2%-ish inflation is kind of normal, but it could be zero. They have some target level. Pick your target level that you think the central bank has. They have a target. Okay? And so the farther we are away from the targets, we are going to assume, this is again is an assumption, the more the central bank is concerned about these things. So if they target 2% inflation and the inflation turns out to be 2.05%, they're kind of, what can you do? Right? But if it turns out to be 5%, they start freaking out. Right? The farther we get away from our target, the bigger of a deal it is to them. Right? That's an assumption. And the last assumption that we need for this story to work is that the target unemployment rate is less than the natural rate of unemployment. So we want a lower rate of unemployment than is normal for this economy. Okay? This doesn't have to be true, but if you think about how disruptive unemployment is to people's lives and what a loss it is for the economy, and if you think, and this is where we have to stretch our imaginations a little bit, like form up your imagination. We're going to think that central bankers are good people, and so they want good things for us, and so they would want the unemployment rate to be less than the target rate. This is our story. Okay? Their target to be less than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? Doesn't have to be, but this is the basis of this story. Okay? Okay. And so we're going to start and look for what does equilibrium look like in this situation. So now we have the situation, which is this short-run Phillips curve that shifts up and down based on people's inflation expectations. And we have a central bank who is now motivated. The central bank is motivated based on these three assumptions. They want to get to these targets. The farther they get away from the targets, the less happy they are. And one of their targets is below what is normal for the economy. So to look at what this equilibrium looks like, we're going to start out by asking this question. And that is it possible for the central bank to achieve its targets? And the answer is going to be no. Right? And so this is we're not going to have an equilibrium where the central bank does achieve its targets. But we want to see that, right? That they can't achieve their targets. Okay? So this is sort of where we're going. We're first establishing central bank achieving their targets is not really possible in this environment. Okay? So here we go. I put in our target unemployment rate, which is less than the normal level of unemployment, the natural rate of unemployment. And I've put in a target level of inflation here. And we are going to assume, we're starting out assuming that the central bank can achieve its targets. Okay. Well, clearly, achieving the long-run unemployment target is probably not possible, right? Because we know that if everything is behaving normally, that unemployment is going to be the normal level of unemployment, right? So in other words, if they were achieving their target unemployment rate, that would mean that it must be the case that inflation is higher than expected inflation. We know in the long run, it must be that people are getting what they expected. So in the long run, it must be that expected inflation is just equal to the actual inflation that we get. Because otherwise, people are going to change their expectations, right? Which means in the long run, we're going to get the natural rate of unemployment. Okay? So this target is clearly, just right off the bat, not sustainable in the long run. But maybe we could get the inflation target, right? Maybe unemployment target's not possible, but maybe we can get the inflation we desire. Okay? That would at least be something. Right? Well, suppose that was true. Suppose that people expected that we would get the target rate of inflation. Okay? The central bank has control of inflation. They don't really have direct control of unemployment, but they have direct control of inflation. And so if they want 3% or 2% inflation, there's nothing stopping them from getting it. So that seems like a reasonable thing to expect. Right? So suppose that was true. We expected the target rate of inflation. Therefore, we got this short-run Phillips curve, where if we get what we expect, we have the natural rate of unemployment. Well, then what does the central bank do? Once people are locked into these contracts, what does the central bank say? Well, it says, I'm getting, I could choose this point. I could choose point A. Totally possible. Well, I can do that if I want. Now, the short-run Phillips curve is locked in. People have set their wages. And so I'm really just picking the inflation rate, and that's going to give me a particular level of unemployment. So if I pick high inflation, I'm going to get low unemployment. If I pick low inflation, I'm going to get high unemployment. I got the Phillips curve. So what do I do? And this is sort of the situation that we are at when the gold standard was abandoned. Right? But now the central bank has this control over the inflation rate. What are they going to choose? Well, at the moment, if we decided to pick our target level of inflation, well, we're getting our target level of inflation. We're not too concerned about inflation, because we're really close to our target. Remember, that was one of our assumptions. But we are far, far from our target rate of unemployment. So we're super concerned about unemployment because we're far from our target. And so I'm really concerned about unemployment. I'm not too concerned about inflation. And so I'm naturally going to increase my level of inflation to reduce the unemployment. I'm going to increase the thing I'm not too concerned about in order to reduce the thing that I really am concerned about. And so we're going to move up to some point like B, right? Which is just exactly the story we had before, that now we have this ability to control unemployment through the inflation rate, and we're going to increase inflation in order to reduce unemployment. Okay? But of course, for individual people, they got screwed because they expected the target rate of inflation in this little scenario, and they didn't get it. So clearly, this was a bad choice of expectations because they're getting screwed, right? So this point A, can't be in equilibrium. Because if we expect that level of inflation, the central bank will actually give us more. Okay. So what we're going to get is what's called an inflation bias. That there's going to be this incentive. If we have low inflation, there's this incentive for the central bank to increase the level of inflation in order to reduce unemployment. And they're going to keep doing this as long as the benefit of reducing unemployment is larger than the cost of increasing inflation. And so the closer we are to our target rate of inflation, well, the less we care about inflation. And the farther we move away, the more we care about inflation. In the long run, people must be guessing the inflation correctly, right? So we have to be at the natural rate of unemployment. But it also has to be the case that the central bank actually wants to give us the inflation that we expected. So it must be that the cost of increasing inflation is so high that it's not worth reducing unemployment anymore, which means we have to be far away from our target level of inflation. right? So that because the farther we move away, the more the central bank cares about that. And we're always going to be far away from the target, or at least in the long run, from the target level of unemployment. And so the cost has to balance that out. So in the long run, we're going to get this inflation bias. We're going to have higher levels of inflation than our target, and we're going to have higher levels of unemployment than our target. Higher levels of unemployment is built into the structure of the thing, where people are going to keep trying to guess the inflation rate until they get it right, in which case we get the natural rate of unemployment. But the inflation being higher than the target rate of inflation is coming about because we have this ability to control the inflation rate, because we have discretionary monetary policy, what in the jargon is called discretionary monetary policy. We can set the money supply wherever we want, just based on what we think is a good idea, in this case, trying to reduce unemployment. Because we have that discretion, we are going to end up with this inflation that we didn't want, and in fact, there's no benefit to it at all, right? Because in the gold standard, where our hands were tied, where we couldn't control the money supply, it was very normal to get point A, right? You get some level of inflation, say it's your target. It's possible anyway that it's your target. You're still going to get the natural rate of unemployment. That sucks, but you're still going to get it in the long run, no matter what you do, right? And so you could have low inflation and the natural rate of unemployment. But now that we have discretionary monetary policy, we have high inflation and the same level of unemployment. We've gained nothing at great cost. Good for us. Yay, Nixon. Well, anyway, that's what happened. Right. Now, it's not all bad. We don't see the not all bad here. The benefit of having this discretionary monetary policy is you can still do stabilization policy, right? So you can do things in the short run, right? This effect on inflation might be kind of a long-run phenomenon. It might take 2 or 3 years to kick in. And so in that 2 or 3 years, you could you could increase output, reducing unemployment. There's things you can do in the short run that you maybe can't do in the long run. So this benefit of monetary policy to stabilize output is still there, but it's not there in the long run, right? So we have this cost of having this discretion, which is this inflation bias. The benefit is that maybe we can smooth things out for a few years, help us get through recessions, that kind of thing. Okay. Whether it's worth it or not, huge area of debate in macroeconomics. Okay. Okay. And the more we care about unemployment, the bigger inflation bias we are going to get, right? Because remember, this is going up. We're increasing our expected inflation until the point where the central bank doesn't want to trick us anymore. That is where the benefit to the central bank of tricking us is that they reduce unemployment, right? The cost is that they increase inflation, right? And so we're going to keep having higher and higher inflation expectations until those two balance out. Well, if the central bank is a real bastard and doesn't care much about unemployment, that happens really quick. He just cares about inflation. So even a little bit of inflation freaks him out. But if he really does care and he's a good person, and then he's going to really care about inflation. So it's got to be a lot of, obviously he really cares about unemployment. Then it's got to be a lot of inflation before he stops trying to trick us, right? And so inflation bias is going to be higher when we have someone who cares a lot about unemployment. That's this. This is Ken Rogoff's conservative central banker. So if, for example, I'm a politician that really, really cares about unemployment, that's my goal, like a nice, good left-wing boy, and I get in there and I just I say, well, who shall I appoint to be head of the central bank? I have somebody who's been with me since the early days, since the labor union days, where we're getting our heads pounded in by the cops. And all of that time, and we rose up together fighting the scourge of unemployment this whole time. And finally, I'm in power. I can appoint Joe because he has exactly my views. He's a good guy. He cares about unemployment. Right. Or I can put someone who cares very much about inflation, some investment banker bastard guy who could care less about the poor. I could appoint him. Okay? It's actually better in this story and in quite a few stories. Like, it's actually better, even if I care a lot about unemployment, I should appoint the guy that doesn't have my views. I should appoint the guy that cares only about inflation, very little about unemployment. Okay. Because the guy who cares a lot about inflation, who doesn't care much about unemployment, is going to end up with the natural rate of unemployment and a very low inflation bias. Whereas if I put my friend in there, he's willing to accept tons of inflation to try to get unemployment down. But in the end, he won't be able to get unemployment down. He'll still have the natural rate of unemployment, but we'll have this huge inflation because he was really trying all that time to get there. Okay? And the fundamental reason for this is that fundamentally, central banking is about moving slips of paper around. Right? And it's not fundamentally about unemployment. It's not that we don't have a good job for my friend, but we have a job that's more about the things he cares about. Right? If we want to get unemployment down, we should have investment in infrastructure. We should have investment in schools. We should have streamlining the labor market. We should be trying to get rid of the money handlers and more in terms of doing actual stuff. Right? There's lots of stuff that we can do to reduce unemployment, but none of that is really about shuffling money around. Right? And central banking is really about shuffling paper around. Right? It's important, it matters, but it's not really addressing what gives us unemployment in the economy. We can do some short-term stuff, like maybe for a couple years we can help out with that, and that's very useful, but we're not going to, in the long term, be able to reduce unemployment by printing more slips of paper. We're going to have to do something real to do that. Okay? And this is not, sorry to all my central banker friends, and I have many, this is not a real job. It's not. It's moving paper around. Okay? Very important. Like it's not trivial. It's difficult, but it's fundamentally about prices, interest rates, and stuff like that. It is not fundamentally about what makes a person get a job in this economy. Right? It's short-term effects on that stuff. Long-term, we're not going to change unemployment by shuffling money around. We're going to have to do something harder. This, by the way, is one reason why we have independent central banks, like independent from the government. Okay? Various countries have various levels of independence from the government, but a good democratic government should care a fair, I don't know about, yes, this is like shoulds, but I think, and this is just my personal opinion, a good democratic government should, to some extent, care about the lives of the people it's governing. I'm just saying. I don't go far out there. But they should, right? And unemployment is a big part of that. So a good democratic government should care about unemployment, amongst other things, right? We would like that from our society, for it to be responsive to the wishes of the governed. Right? That would be a nice thing. But central banking fundamentally is not about that. It's about shifting the paper around. Fundamentally, it's about inflation, interest rates, these sorts of things. Short-term effects that matter, for sure, but not in the long term. Right? So if we had like a good democratic government that does care about unemployment to a reasonable extent, we are going to end up, and it controlled the central bank, if it controlled the printing of the money, it would naturally have a higher inflation bias than if we appoint some real bastard to the place. Right? Because they're going to care about that stuff, but it's fundamentally something they can't control in the long run, so you're going to end up with a high inflation bias. Okay? So by offloading that job to some scumbag investment banker, not that I have an opinion on these things, by offloading that job, you get a lower inflation bias, and it doesn't fundamentally change the natural rate of unemployment. So it's only a benefit. That's one reason for an independent central bank. The main reason, of course, is because governments, from time to time, really, really need money, right? And printing money is one way to get it, right? And so if it's very easy to print money, get your seigniorage, and pay for all the things you want to do, governments have a tendency over time to do that more and more, and you end up with really high inflation rates, right? Just like Germany hyperinflation kind of thing can happen. So that's our fundamental reasons. Those are the two main reasons why we separate central banks from the government to a greater or lesser extent in different countries. All right. Hey. Example 2 is what happens if we want to bring inflation under control. That is, we have high inflation and we want to have lower inflation over time. Okay. So let's suppose that we've been going on for years with really high inflation rates. And we come along and we say, okay, this is not working for us as a society. Let's appoint someone new. Let's appoint someone who really, really, really cares about getting inflation under control. Okay. This is someone who cares less about unemployment, and they care much more about inflation. So this person is going to have a lower inflation bias than our previous person, right? Because again, the inflation bias is where the benefit of decreasing unemployment is just matched by the cost of increasing inflation. And so if we really care about inflation, that's going to kick in quicker than if we care a lot about unemployment. Okay. So what will happen if we have this high inflation and then we want to lower it? Well, sadly, it depends. Let's suppose point A is our initial point. So this blue line is our short-run Phillips curve where everyone had their initial expectations. And this one at the bottom is sort of our long run. Like if this guy stayed in for 1,000 years and people finally learned about him, that we would have this level of inflation expectations. There's still an inflation bias, right? It's this higher inflation than his target, but it's going to be much lower inflation. So we have A is our initial point with somebody else's, but this is based on expectation of somebody else, the old central bank governor, and the red ones are based on the new central bank governor, and here's our new long-run equilibrium. Right. Well, what's going to happen? Well, here it really, really depends. It really depends on people's expectations, right? Because these Phillips curves are based on what's going on in people's heads when they're negotiating wages. If we think inflation is going to be high, then we're going to build in very high inflation expectations. We're going to build in very high wages, and we're going to have a very high Phillips curve. If we think inflation is going to be low, then we'll have small wage increases, and we will have a very low Phillips curve. And that, I'm afraid, is all in our heads. Okay? In the long run, we're going to cop on, and we're going to get the real thing, right? We're going to get what we expected. But that's not necessarily true in the short run. So one thing I could think, a very reasonable thing, government makes a big announcement. Right? We're thinking like Israel in the 80s, or we're thinking, Brazil from the podcast. So we've got a country with really high inflation, right? And Argentina keeps doing this as well. Loads of countries you're high inflation, and you're trying to get it under control. You appoint the new central bank governor. You make a big show. You come in, you say, I appointed this new governor. We're going to get inflation under control by Tuesday, and this is all we care about, et cetera, all the things politicians say. And we say them. And we say them well because we're very articulate. And we do that, right? Well, people can buy it or not, right? It's in their head. And if people think, we have a government every Thursday. We think about Italy in the 70s, right? Government every Thursday, there's a new government. These guys come in, they talk big, they're going to be gone by next week. No one's going to buy that, right? In which case, people's expectations will stay exactly the same. And this guy really does care about reducing inflation. But if he reduces inflation, you're going to have a very big increase in unemployment, right? Because we have this very high Phillips curve. And so he's going to reduce inflation a little bit, but it's going to be really costly. Unemployment's going to go up. And suppose this government sticks around for a while. So by some miracle, they're still in power a week from now. And everything's still the same, and we still think they're going to be gone in a week. Then, again, we're going to build in the same inflation expectations, and this guy's still going to be giving us the same, a little bit slightly lower inflation, but at this cost of high unemployment. Right? So if people are not buying that this thing is really going to work, then they're not going to lower their wages, or they're going to keep getting very high wage increases, which means it's going to be very, very costly to reduce unemployment. Eventually, people will realize, okay, I'm not getting the inflation I expected, and they're going to slowly lower their inflation expectations. And we're going to sort of work our way down slowly with lower and lower Phillips curve, maybe for years. And for years, we're going to have very high unemployment. Right? As these guys, really who don't care about unemployment very much and care about inflation, just try to keep working down the rate of inflation. And eventually, it'll come down. But because stupid democracy being the way it is, if you have high unemployment for years on end, eventually your government's over and you're out of there and the whole thing breaks down. We go back to point A. Okay? And so we see lots and lots and lots of countries that try to control high inflation. And they come in and they announce that we're going to do it because obviously politicians are going to promise all good things to people. Right? All good things. What was his name? Pedro. Vote for me and all your dreams will come true. But they're always going to do that. And so they do that, but nobody buys it. And because nobody buys it, the Phillips curve stays where it is. And then when you reduce inflation, it's really, really, really costly. And so you see lots of these things. They come in with an inflation program, and it lasts a few months, and then they give it up because it's just way too costly and unemployment goes up way too much. Okay? On the other hand, exactly the same circumstances, but now people believe that the government is really committed to this. They're really committed to this. They're going to do this no matter what. The government has a big majority. Everyone voted for them. And not only do they have a big majority, so they're going to be in for a while, but they come in and their whole talk was, we're going to get rid of inflation. That's our thing. Right? And that's what they stake their reputation on. And then you start to believe that they're really committed to it. And even if it's hard, they're going to stick with it. Okay? So suppose that's the case. In that case, we could say, well, these guys are really into this thing. And they appointed this new central bank governor. And at the very first opportunity to renegotiate our wages, we could think inflation is going to be real low. And so our Phillips curve could shift down here right away, not taking years. In which case inflation could come down in no time with no cost whatsoever. With very, very minimal cost to society, very, very little change in unemployment. If people adjust their expectations and they truly believe this is going to work, then it works. It's like Tinkerbell. I do believe in fairies. I do. I believe inflation will come down. If we all believe it together, it will happen. If we all believe inflation is going to be high together, well, the central bank kind of has to go along with that in the end. Here we go. Right. A lot of macroeconomics has a Tinkerbell quality to it. Right? Banking is that way. If we believe our banks are stable, they're stable. If we believe that they're going to go under, we're all going to take our money out, and they will go under. Right? There's a lot of this going on. If we think next year is going to be good, we all buy stuff this year, and indeed next year is good. If we think next year is going to be a recession, we all save up so that we have something for the bad times, and indeed that causes a recession. A lot of Tinkerbell going on here, right, in macroeconomics, and this is another one. But you'll see, like if you look at sort of the history of people trying to deal with high inflation and try to bring it down, the times when it's kind of like a series of unstable governments, whenever they try to do it, it's always very costly and never works. In times when it's it seems like a stable government. They have a big enough majority that they can weather some storms, and they make inflation their number one priority publicly, then it can work, and it can work quite painlessly, not painlessly, but with not too much disruption of the economy. And so the question is, like, how do you get inflation under control? Well, it could be extremely painful if people don't buy it, and you have to slowly work the short-run Phillips curve down, or it could be really easy, relatively easy, just depending. Okay? Which is, if you listen to the podcast, the Drinking Buddies one, about the control of the inflation in Brazil, if not, go back and do it. You can view all of that in terms of this Phillips curve. That is, they're establishing the beliefs so that this Phillips curve shifts down quickly rather than slowly being dragged down little by little by little with high unemployment the whole time. Okay, that is all the material for our course. We are done. On the slides, For those of you who know indifference curves, I go through all this stuff with indifference curves, but you're not required to know that. If indifference curves come easily to you and you like them, that's a way to go at this. You can look. I'm not going to talk about them here. But that's all we've got. Like, you're not required to know the indifference curve stuff. You're required up till here. Okay. So that's all our material. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to do exam prep. So I'm going to talk about, on Tuesday, I'll talk about what's on the exam format, 30 multiple choice questions, just a longer version of what you had before. And then on Thursday, we'll have review sessions. So what you should be doing is take a look at old questions. And I think you can do pretty much all of them that are out there. I haven't looked carefully, but I think all of them are fair game. So give them a try and come with questions next week, because ideally I wouldn't ramble on. Ideally I'd be answering your questions. Okay. Have a good weekend.